A mafia boss pays a homeless woman to have his heir, but when the twins were born, he realized he had made a deal that would change everything. Marcus Castellano was a 36-year-old man who ruled the criminal underworld of New York with an iron fist. He had everything: money, power, fear, and respect. But that night, as he sat alone in his penthouse staring at the city lights below, he realized that despite all the empire he had built, there was one thing missing: an heir. He needed a child to carry on the Castellano legacy. But Marcus did not want a family in the traditional sense. He had been engaged once, and that woman had betrayed him, selling information to his enemies and nearly getting him killed. The scar on his left jaw was a permanent reminder of that night. He thought love was a weakness, something that only brought destruction. But a child was different. It was a continuation of his bloodline, an investment in the future of everything he had fought and bled for. And now he was determined not to seek a relationship for this. He needed a clean arrangement without emotional complications, just a contract. He knew that with his resources and his reputation, he could find someone willing to carry the pregnancy without questions or emotional ties. For Marcus, this was a transaction, and like all his transactions, he would have total control. Now he just needed to find someone who would accept the deal. The next morning, Marcus Castellano drove his black Bentley through the streets of Lower East Side. His mind, however, was focused on finding someone who would accept the contract. And while stopped at a light near a dark alley, something caught his attention. In the shadows, a young woman sat on the cold ground, sketching on a crumpled piece of paper with a piece of charcoal. She had long black hair falling messily over her thin face, and her green eyes shone with a strange light despite her exhausted and broken appearance. Her clothes were torn, and there were faint bruises on her arms. She seemed invisible to the world, forgotten by everyone, but something about her caught Marcus's eye. He tried to ignore her, but when the light turned green, he looked again and thought, "Who sits in a filthy alley drawing as if nothing else matters?" Annoyed with himself, he sped away, leaving her behind. But a few blocks away, something bothered him. He stopped in an empty lot and sat there, gripping the steering wheel, when an idea came to him. "This is ridiculous," he said to himself, but his instinct pushed him back. Reluctantly, he turned the car around and went back to where he had seen her. If this story touches your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Now let us see what happens when Marcus steps out of his car and approaches the mysterious woman in the alley. Marcus stopped the Bentley right beside the dark alley and stepped out of the car. His footsteps echoed on the damp concrete as he moved toward the girl one step at a time. When she heard the sound, she lifted her head and her green eyes widened in fear. She immediately shrank back, her spine pressed flat against the cold brick wall, both arms wrapped tightly around the unfinished sketch, clutched to her chest, as if it were the most precious thing she owned. "Please don't hit me," she said, her voice trembling but trying to stay steady. "I have nothing. I swear I have nothing. Tell Ricci I'll pay. Just give me more time." Marcus stopped and frowned at her. He realized she thought he was one of the debt collectors. That meant she owed someone, and from the name Ricci that she had just spoken, he knew it wasn't a small debt. "I'm not Ricci's man," Marcus said, his voice cold but not threatening. The girl looked at him with suspicion, still not daring to believe him. Her eyes flicked over his expensive suit, the watch on his wrist, and the luxury car parked behind him. "Then what do you want from me?" she asked, her voice still shaking. "I have an offer," Marcus answered briefly. "Stand up." She didn't move, her eyes still fixed on him, as if she were trying to read what kind of man he was. Marcus wasn't used to being refused. He wasn't used to waiting either. "I said stand up," he repeated, his voice heavier now, carrying the authority he had used to make the entire underworld bow its head. The girl shuddered. There was something in this man's voice that told her he wasn't someone to argue with. Slowly she stood, and for the first time Marcus saw her clearly in the dim streetlight. She was thinner than he had imagined. Her collarbones jutted beneath her torn clothes, and the bruises on her arms were not just one or two but scattered everywhere, as if she had been beaten many times. And yet there was something in her eyes that wasn't broken. She was afraid. Yes, but she wasn't defeated. "Who are you?" Marcus asked. "Ivy," she said after a moment's hesitation. "Ivy Harper. And who are you?" Marcus didn't answer that question. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the car. "Follow me," he ordered without looking back. Ivy stayed where she was, unsure what to do. Following a strange man in the middle of the night was the craziest thing she could do. But what about staying here? Staying here meant continuing to be hungry, continuing to be cold, continuing to wait for the debt collectors to come back, and this time they might not just hit her. Marcus stopped by the car door and turned his head toward her. "I don't have all day," he said coldly. "You can follow me and hear my offer, or you can stay in this alley and keep living the life you're living. The choice is yours." Ivy looked down at the paper in her hand, the unfinished drawing of a flower growing out of a crack in the concrete. She had been drawing it for days, over and over, because she had nothing else to do. She didn't know what this man wanted, but she knew that if she didn't take this chance, she might never have another one. Slowly, Ivy walked toward the car. When she slid into the back seat, the scent of fine leather and expensive cologne filled her senses, reminding her that she was stepping into a completely different world. Marcus took the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away without another word. Ivy sat still in the darkness, her heart pounding, wondering whether she had just stepped into fortune or into hell. Marcus drove through the empty streets of New York until he stopped in front of a small restaurant hidden inside a quiet alley. There was no sign, no bright neon lights, only a heavy wooden door with two men in black suits standing guard outside. When they saw Marcus step out of the car, they both bowed their heads. Ivy followed behind him, feeling their eyes sweep over her with curiosity and quiet assessment. Inside the restaurant, the warm and elegant atmosphere overwhelmed her. Crystal chandeliers, oak tables and chairs, and the rich scent of food filled her senses. Her stomach tightened and growled, reminding her that she hadn't had a proper meal in 3 days. Marcus led her to a table, tucked into a corner where no one could see them. He signaled the waiter to bring food without even looking at the menu. A few minutes later, a table full of dishes was placed in front of Ivy. She stared at the plate of beef, the bowl of steaming soup, and the crusty bread, and swallowed hard. "Eat," Marcus said briefly. Ivy didn't need to be told twice. She picked up the spoon and began to eat, trying to hold herself back so she wouldn't devour everything like someone who'd been starved. But the hunger was too strong, and she couldn't control it. Marcus sat across from her, watching her eat without saying a word. He noticed the slight tremor in her hand as she held the spoon, the way her eyes flicked around as if she were afraid someone might snatch the food from her. When Ivy finished and had calmed down, Marcus finally spoke. "Tell me," he said, his voice flat. "Who are you? Where are you from? And why do you owe Ricci money?" Ivy set the spoon down, her eyes darkening. She stayed silent for a long moment before she began to speak. "I'm an orphan," she said, her voice low and tired. "I grew up in foster care. No family, no one. When I was 22, I met a man named Tony Ricci. He said he loved me, said he'd give me a home. I believed him." Marcus said nothing, only listened. Ivy went on. "We got married," she said bitterly. "And then I found out he was a gambling addict. He beat me. He took all the money I earned, and he borrowed everywhere. 3 years. I endured 3 years of hell. Then one night he disappeared. He ran away and left me with a massive debt he'd borrowed from gangs. They threw me out of the house, took everything, and beat me whenever they found me. That's why you're living on the streets," Marcus said. Not a question, but a statement. Ivy nodded, her eyes damp, but she didn't cry. She'd cried too much already. There were no tears left. Marcus leaned back, his hands clasped in front of him. He looked at her for a long time as if weighing something. Then he spoke. "I have an offer for you," he said slowly. "An offer that could change your life." Ivy looked at him and waited. "I want you to get pregnant for me." Ivy thought she'd misheard. She blinked and stared at Marcus as if he'd just spoken in a language she didn't understand. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "I need an heir," Marcus said bluntly, without embarrassment, "a child with my blood. But I don't want marriage. I don't want feelings. I don't want any kind of attachment. I just need a woman willing to carry the child, give birth, and leave. This is a contract, nothing more." Ivy jumped to her feet, the chair scraping loudly across the wooden floor. "You're insane," she said, her voice shaking with anger and shock. "What kind of person do you think I am to make an offer like that?" Marcus didn't flinch. "I think you're someone with nothing left to lose," he replied coldly. "And I think you're smart enough to see that this is your only chance." Ivy stood there, her chest rising and falling with anger, staring at Marcus as if he were the most insane man she had ever met. "Who do you think you are?" she said, her voice shaking with restraint. "Do you think you can buy me like you buy an object? I may be poor, I may have nothing, but I'm not the kind of woman who sells her body to a stranger." Marcus remained seated, showing no sign of being affected by her anger. He had seen far worse fury than this, had faced men pointing guns at his head without flinching, and a thin girl shouting in his restaurant was nothing to him. "Sit down," he said, his voice not loud but heavy with authority. "You haven't heard everything I have to say." Ivy wanted to leave, wanted to turn her back on this man and his insane offer, but her feet wouldn't move. Maybe she was too tired. Maybe part of her wanted to know what else he could possibly say. Slowly, she sat down again, her eyes still wary. Marcus gave a small nod, as if satisfied that she had agreed to listen. "This is what you'll receive if you agree," he began, his tone calm, as if he were reading a business contract. "First, your former husband's debt will be erased. I know the people Tony Ricci borrowed from. With one call from me, they'll never dare touch you again." Ivy drew in a sharp breath. She had lived in fear of the debt collectors for months, had been found and beaten by them more times than she could count, and the thought of escaping that nightmare made her heart race even though she didn't want to admit it. "Second," Marcus continued, "throughout the pregnancy you'll live in my estate, protected 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You'll have your own room, food, clothes, a private doctor, everything you need. No one will be able to touch you while you're under my protection." He paused and looked straight into her eyes. "And third, after the birth, you'll receive $5 million, enough for you to start a completely new life anywhere you want." Ivy felt the air in the room grow suddenly heavy. $5 million was a number she had never dared to dream of. With that money, she could buy a small house, open an art studio like she had always dreamed, live without worrying about tomorrow. But what was the price? Carrying a child for a stranger, giving birth, and then leaving the child behind. "What about the baby?" Ivy asked, her voice smaller now. "What happens after I give birth?" "You'll give up all maternal rights," Marcus replied without hesitation. "The child will be mine, entirely mine. You'll have no authority or responsibility toward it after the birth." This term is not negotiable. Ivy felt a sharp pain in her chest. She imagined carrying a life inside her for months, feeling it grow, and then letting go. It was the cruelest thing she had ever heard, and yet she also thought about her current life, hunger, cold, and daily fear. If she kept living like this, she might die before she ever saw next spring. "I need time," Ivy finally said, her voice hoarse. "I can't decide right now." Marcus nodded as if he had expected that answer. "You have 24 hours, he said, taking a small phone and a business card from his pocket and placing them on the table in front of her. "After that, don't contact me." He stood, buttoned his jacket. "I'll have someone take you wherever you want. Think carefully, Ivy Harper. An opportunity like this doesn't come twice." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Ivy alone with the cold phone in her hand and a decision that could change her entire life. Marcus's men took Ivy back to the alley where she had been living for months. When the sleek black car slid away and disappeared into the night, Ivy stood alone in the darkness, her hand still gripping the phone and the business card. She looked around at the stained brick walls, the reeking trash bins, and the torn blanket she used to sleep with every night. This was her home, if it could be called a home. Ivy sat down in her familiar corner with her back against the cold wall. She lifted her eyes to the night sky but couldn't see a single star through the city lights. Her mind spun, and the memories she had tried to bury came rushing back like a flood. She remembered the orphanage where she grew up without love, the cold caretakers who treated the children like burdens, the beatings whenever she did something wrong, the nights she cried alone in her bed longing for a mother she had never seen. She remembered leaving the orphanage the day she turned 18, stepping into the world with empty hands and a heart full of naive hope. She worked herself to exhaustion, washing dishes in restaurants, cleaning hotel rooms, doing anything that would earn money. Then she met Tony Ricci with his charming smile and sweet promises. He said he loved her, said he would give her a family and a home, everything she had wanted all her life, and she believed him like a fool dying of thirst in the desert. Their wedding was small, just the two of them. She was happy and thought life was finally smiling at her, but that happiness lasted only a few weeks. Tony's true nature emerged. He was addicted to gambling, lost all his money, then turned to beating her to vent his rage. The first time he slapped her, she cried and believed his apology. The second time he punched her in the stomach, she stayed because she thought he would change. The third time, the fourth, the fifth, she lost count. 3 years of hell, 3 years of fear and pain. She had wanted to run, but he threatened to find her and kill her if she ever left. Then one night, Tony disappeared. He lost everything in a big gamble and fled, leaving her with a massive debt he had borrowed from the most dangerous gangs in the city. They came for her, searched the apartment, took everything of value, and when there was nothing left to take, they beat her and said they would come back every week until the debt was paid. She ran and lived on the streets, moving constantly to avoid being found. But they still found her, and every time they left, more bruises on her body. Ivy looked down at the phone in her hand, its screen glowing in the dark. She thought about Marcus's offer, carrying a child for a stranger, giving birth, and then giving it up. It was cruel. It was wrong. It went against everything she believed in. But what choice did she have? A cold wind blew and made her shiver. She thought of the coming winter and the freezing nights she wasn't sure she could survive. She thought of the debt collectors and the look in their eyes when they said next time they wouldn't just beat her. She thought of the future, an empty and hopeless future if she kept going this way. Then she thought of the drawing still tucked in her pocket, the flower growing out of a crack in the concrete. Maybe this was her crack. Maybe this was her only chance to grow. Ivy took a deep breath and with trembling fingers dialed the number on the phone. Her heart pounded as it rang once, twice. Then someone answered on the other end. "I agree," Ivy said, her voice hoarse but steady. "I'll follow your contract." There was a brief silence. Then Marcus's voice came through, as cold as the first time she had heard it. "Someone will come for you tomorrow morning. Don't bring anything." Then the call ended. Ivy sat there in the darkness watching the screen fade to black, wondering whether she had just stepped into heaven or into hell. The next morning, exactly as Marcus had said, a sleek black car stopped in front of the alley. Ivy had been awake all night, unable to sleep for even a minute. She rose on aching legs and stepped into the car, carrying only the unfinished drawing in her pocket, because she had nothing else to take with her. The car drove through the crowded streets of New York, and then slowly entered a quiet suburban area. And when it stopped before a massive iron gate, Ivy couldn't believe her eyes, because behind the gate stood an enormous white mansion, like a palace from the fairy tales she had read as a child, with green gardens stretching wide, a marble fountain in the center of the courtyard, and dozens of tall windows reflecting the morning light. Ivy stepped out of the car, feeling as if she were dreaming, because just yesterday she had been sitting in a filthy alley, and now she was standing in front of a place like this. A middle-aged man in a black suit met her at the door and introduced himself as Dante Marchetti, Marcus's right-hand man, and his cold, assessing eyes swept over her from head to toe as if she were an object to be evaluated, which made Ivy uncomfortable, but she said nothing and followed him inside. The interior was even more dazzling than the outside, with crystal chandeliers hanging from high ceilings, polished marble floors reflecting her image, and expensive oil paintings lining the walls, and she had never set foot in a place like this in her life. Dante led her into a large room where Marcus was already waiting behind an oak desk, and beside him sat a man with glasses who looked like a lawyer with a thick stack of papers in front of him. "Sit down," Marcus ordered without greeting her, and Ivy sat in the chair opposite him with her heart pounding while the lawyer began reading the contract in a flat, cold voice like he was reading a financial report. And Ivy tried to listen, but the legal terms made her head spin, and she only understood the main points. That she would carry Marcus's child through artificial insemination, that she would live in the mansion and be fully cared for throughout the pregnancy, that after the birth she would give up all maternal rights and receive $5 million, that she wasn't allowed to tell anyone about the agreement, and that if she violated it, she'd lose everything and face legal consequences. When the lawyer finished, Marcus pushed a pen toward her and told her to sign, and Ivy took the pen with a slight tremble and looked at the final line where her name was needed, knowing this was the moment she couldn't turn back from. So she took a deep breath and signed Ivy Harper in shaky handwriting, and Marcus took the contract back, glanced at her signature, signed beneath it himself, and said it was done before standing and telling her Rosa would take her to her room. As if summoned, a middle-aged woman appeared at the door with salt and pepper hair neatly tied back and a gentle face lined with soft wrinkles. And unlike everyone else in the house, her eyes were warm and not assessing at all, and she spoke kindly with a slight Spanish accent and told Ivy to follow her, and Ivy did, walking through long, quiet corridors until Rosa stopped at a door and opened it and said this was her room. Ivy stepped inside and froze, because the room was larger than the apartment she had shared with Tony, with a king-sized bed dressed in white sheets, a walnut wardrobe, a vanity with a large mirror, and a window overlooking a bright flower garden. And Ivy turned back to Rosa, not knowing what to say, while Rosa smiled and gently patted her shoulder and told her to rest and that she was safe here now. Then she stepped out and closed the door softly, leaving Ivy alone in the luxurious room, looking around as if trying to confirm this was real, then walking to the window and looking out at the sunlit garden while realizing her new life was beginning here inside the golden cage of a Mafia boss. 3 days after signing the contract, Dante knocked on Ivy's door early in the morning and told her briefly to get ready because she was going to see the doctor today. And Ivy knew this day would come, but when it truly arrived, she still felt a vague fear rise in her chest. So she changed into the clothes Rosa had prepared in the wardrobe and followed Dante to the car. And during the entire drive, she said nothing, only stared out the window wondering what she was doing with her life. And the car stopped in front of a white building hidden in a quiet neighborhood with no hospital sign or clinic name. only a glass door and 2 guards standing watch. And Ivy understood this was the Castellano family's private medical facility, where everything was kept absolutely secret. And inside, an older doctor greeted her with a cold, professional manner, not asking her name or how she felt, only ordering her to change and lie on the examination table. And Ivy obeyed, feeling like a puppet being moved. With the room blindingly white, the sharp smell of disinfectant in the air, and cold light shining directly into her face, and the doctor and nurses worked around her, speaking in medical terms she didn't understand, no one looking into her eyes and no one speaking to her, because she was only a vessel, a tool for Marcus Castellano's purpose. And the artificial insemination procedure was quick. But for Ivy it felt endless as she lay there staring at the white ceiling, trying not to think about what was happening to her body while thinking about the money and the new life waiting for her and escaping the debt collectors. But those thoughts weren't enough to soothe the emptiness spreading inside her. And when it was over, Dante took her back to the mansion and Marcus didn't appear. No call and no message. Because to him, this was just another step in a process, no different from signing a contract or closing a deal. And Ivy returned to her room, closed the door, lay on the bed, curled into herself, hugging a pillow, and for the first time since arriving she cried, not from pain but from the feeling that she was no longer human, that she had sold the most sacred thing a woman had, and the price she received was coldness and indifference. And then there was a soft knock and the door opened slightly and Rosa entered, carrying a tray of hot tea. And when she saw Ivy crying, she said nothing, only set the tray down, and sat on the edge of the bed, placing a hand on her shoulder. And Ivy lifted her head with red eyes and asked why Rosa was kind to her when she was just a stranger and a tool her employer had hired to bear a child. And Rosa sighed, and her gaze grew distant as she said she had been here a very long time, and had watched Marcus grow up from when he was a boy. And Ivy stayed silent, waiting. And Rosa continued that he hadn't always been like this, and that he used to be a child who laughed and loved, but when his father was betrayed and murdered in front of him, and when his mother died from grief, he froze his heart, and believed that if he loved no one, he'd never be hurt again. And Ivy looked at Rosa, and for the first time felt something other than fear and resentment toward Marcus, and quietly asked about the scar on his jaw. And Rosa nodded, and said it was from that night, the night he lost everything. Then she stood and poured a cup of tea into Ivy's hands, and said she wasn't asking Ivy to forgive or sympathize with him, but to know that behind the coldness was a heart that had been shattered. And Rosa left the room, leaving Ivy alone with the warm tea and her tangled thoughts. 2 weeks passed in silence, and Ivy lived in the mansion like a ghost, moving through the luxurious rooms without belonging to any of them, barely seeing Marcus, except for the occasional glimpse of him in the corridor, or the sound of his car leaving at night. And Rosa was the only one who spoke to her each day, bringing her nourishing meals and asking about her gently. And that morning Dante knocked on her door again, and told her briefly that the doctor would come to take her blood for testing, and then left. And Ivy knew this was the moment of confirmation, and her heart beat faster at the thought that the procedure might have worked. And part of her hoped it had failed so she could leave this place, while another part feared returning to the dark alley and the debt collectors. And the doctor came and took her blood and left without another word. And Ivy waited all day, unable to do anything but sit by the window and look out at the garden. And when dusk fell, the door opened, and Marcus walked in, and for the first time since signing the contract, she saw him clearly again in his black suit with his cold expression, but there was something different in his eyes that she couldn't read. And he told her she was pregnant, and that the doctor had confirmed a positive result, and Ivy felt as if someone had punched her in the chest, because even though she had prepared herself, she couldn't control her emotions on hearing it, and realized she was carrying a small life inside her, that she would have to give up the moment it was born. And Marcus watched her reaction in silence, seeing her shoulders tremble and her eyes redden even as she tried to hold it back. And although he had expected this, seeing it still stirred something strange in his chest, and he said that from now on, someone would be with her around the clock, and the doctor would check on her every week, and that she should tell Rosa if she needed anything. And Ivy lifted her head in surprise at those words, because she had expected only coldness and indifference, and not even the smallest sign of care. And Marcus noticed her look and immediately turned his face away and said sharply not to misunderstand, because he was only protecting his investment and the child was his heir, and he wouldn't allow anything to happen to it. And then he walked toward the door, but before leaving, he paused and said, without turning back in a softer voice, that if she felt unwell, she should tell Rosa immediately and not try to endure it alone. And then he left, and the door closed behind him. And Ivy sat there, staring at the closed door, with her heart racing, and his last words echoing in her mind about not enduring it alone, unsure whether it was the coldest or the kindest thing he had ever said to her. And she placed her hand on her belly where a small life was beginning to form, knowing that her life would never be the same again. The following weeks were hell for Ivy. The morning sickness arrived like a sudden storm and tore through her already fragile body. Every morning she woke and rushed to the bathroom to retch violently, even when there was nothing left in her stomach. The smell of food made her nauseous, and even the scent of flowers in the garden turned her uneasy. Rosa tried to cook gentle meals like thin porridge, chicken soup, toasted bread. But Ivy could only manage a few spoonfuls before vomiting it all back up. Her weight dropped noticeably, and her already thin face grew more hollow. The doctor came and said it was a normal reaction in early pregnancy, gave her anti-nausea medicine, and told her to try to eat, but that was easier said than done. Ivy lay in bed all day, exhausted, to the point she could barely move, and began to wonder if her body could survive 9 months like this. One night, when the mansion was asleep, Ivy jolted awake with the worst wave of nausea she had ever felt. She staggered into the bathroom, knelt before the toilet, and vomited violently. But this time it was different because there was blood. Frightened, she tried to stand, but her head spun. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed onto the cold tile floor. She lay there, unable to call for help and unable to move, tears running down her cheeks mixing with cold sweat. She thought she would die there alone in the bathroom of a luxurious mansion with no one knowing. Then the bathroom door burst open, and Ivy lifted her eyes to see Marcus standing there, his face paling when he saw her on the floor. For a brief moment she saw something flash in his cold gray eyes that looked like fear. Then he rushed to her, knelt beside her, and called her name with tension in his voice, asking if she could hear him. Ivy tried to speak, but no sound came. Marcus didn't wait. He slipped his arms beneath her and lifted her gently as if she weighed nothing, carried her to the bed, laid her down, and grabbed his phone to call the doctor. His voice was cold and commanding as always, but with an urgency Ivy had never heard before, as he ordered him to come immediately no matter the hour. While waiting, Marcus sat by her bed saying nothing and watching her with an unreadable gaze. Then he went into the bathroom and returned with a wet cloth, sat on the edge of the bed, and gently wiped the sweat from her forehead. His hand was warm and steady, so unlike his usual coldness. Ivy stared at him, too surprised to speak. This was the man who treated her like a tool, like an investment, like a contract. Yet the man sitting here wiping her brow in the middle of the night was someone entirely different. The doctor arrived, examined Ivy, and gave her fluids, saying she was severely dehydrated and needed closer monitoring. Marcus stood in the corner the entire time, watching her without looking away. When the doctor left, it was nearly morning, and Ivy was more alert, the fluids restoring some strength. She thought Marcus would leave, but he stayed sitting in the chair beside her bed. She weakly told him he didn't need to be there because she was fine. Marcus looked at her with the same unreadable face and said he would stay until she slept, and his voice allowed no argument. Ivy was too tired to resist. Her eyes slowly closed, and just before she drifted off, she heard Marcus's voice, softer and almost like a whisper, telling her not to scare him like that again. She wasn't sure if she had really heard it, or if it was only a dream. When she woke the next morning, the chair beside the bed was empty, and on the table there was a bowl of hot porridge and a single white rose. There was no note and no explanation, but Ivy knew who it was from. After that night, something changed in the way Ivy saw Marcus. She no longer saw him only as a cold mafia boss, a man who had bought her like a possession. She began to feel curious, began to want to understand the person behind that icy shell. As the nausea slowly eased, Ivy was able to walk around the mansion more. She explored rooms she had never dared to enter before, long silent corridors lined with expensive paintings and antiques. And during those walks, she began to observe Marcus from a distance. She noticed how much he worked, how he was often in his office from early morning until late at night, the tense meetings, the phone calls in a cold, authoritative voice, the nights he returned with exhaustion clearly written on his face. Sometimes he came back with injuries, a cut on his hand, a bruise on his cheek, and Rosa would quietly bring a first aid kit to his room. Ivy didn't ask, but she knew the world he lived in was a world of violence and danger. One night Ivy couldn't sleep. She went downstairs to get a glass of water, and when she passed Marcus's office, she saw the door slightly open, with warm light spilling into the hallway. She meant to walk past, but a strange impulse made her stop and look inside. Marcus was sitting there alone in the dim light of a single desk lamp. He wasn't working, wasn't looking at papers or a screen. He was holding a photograph, and on his usually cold face was an expression Ivy had never seen before: pain, loneliness, and a deep, aching longing. Ivy held her breath and didn't dare move. She saw the photo in his hand, an old faded picture of a man and a woman smiling. His parents. Rosa had told her about them, about the terrible night Marcus lost everything, but seeing him sitting here alone in the middle of the night holding their photo like a lost child was when Ivy truly understood. Marcus wasn't a monster. He was a man who had been broken by life, who had lost everyone he loved, and who had chosen to freeze his heart so he would never have to endure that pain again. Ivy slipped away without letting Marcus know she had seen him. But that night she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed thinking about the man whose child she was carrying and felt a compassion she hadn't expected. The next morning, Ivy found a stack of paper and pencils in the drawer of the desk. Rosa had left them there, knowing Ivy liked to draw. Ivy sat by the window, looking out at the sunlit garden, and began to draw. She drew a rose in bloom, its soft petals reaching for the light. When she finished, she looked at it for a long time and then made a decision. She went to Marcus's office while he wasn't there, and placed the drawing on his desk without a note, and quietly left. That evening when she passed the office again, she glanced inside and saw the drawing was gone. She didn't know whether Marcus had thrown it away or kept it, and she didn't ask. The next day she drew another one, a sunrise over New York City, and placed it on his desk again, and again it disappeared. And so every day Ivy drew a small picture and left it in Marcus's office. A bird in flight, an autumn leaf, a shining star. She said nothing, and he said nothing, but an invisible thread was slowly forming between them, woven from silent drawings and fleeting glances. Ivy didn't know if Marcus understood what the drawings meant, but she knew that every time one disappeared, her heart beat a little faster. That night came like any other, quiet and calm. Ivy had grown used to the rhythm of life in the mansion, the footsteps of guards patrolling the grounds, the warm light spilling from Marcus's office whenever she passed by. She was lying on her bed with one hand resting on her belly that had begun to swell slightly and the other holding a book Rosa had brought her. She was 3 months along, and the child inside her was growing each day, and she had begun to feel its presence, a small life depending on her. Suddenly, a loud explosion tore through the night, and Ivy jolted upright, the book falling to the floor. Her heart raced as gunshots rang out again and again from the main gate of the mansion. There was shouting, running, glass shattering. She heard Dante yelling orders and voices shouting back in languages she didn't understand. The mansion was under attack. Ivy jumped from the bed with trembling legs, not knowing what to do. She ran to the door but didn't dare open it, because outside was chaos and violence and death. She backed away with her spine against the wall and both arms wrapped around her belly to protect the child inside. The door burst open and Ivy almost screamed, but it was Marcus standing there in a black shirt with a gun in his hand and blood running down his forehead. His gray eyes swept the room and stopped on her. He ordered her to follow him now in a cold, urgent voice. Before Ivy could react, Marcus grabbed her hand and pulled her from the room. He led her through dark corridors and past shadowed rooms, while gunfire still echoed behind them. Ivy struggled to keep up because she wasn't used to running, and her 3-month belly slowed her down. Marcus noticed and stopped and turned and lifted her into his arms. He told her to hold onto his neck and she did without thinking. He ran faster, carrying her like the most precious thing in his life. They reached a hidden door behind the library. Marcus set her down, opened it, and pushed her inside. He told her quickly this was the safe room with a steel door and reinforced concrete walls, and no one could get in, and she was to stay there until he came back. Ivy looked at him, too afraid to speak. As Marcus turned to leave, she grabbed his sleeve and asked what about him. Marcus looked at her, and for a moment the ice on his face seemed to soften. He told her he would be fine and to take care of herself. Then he closed the door, leaving Ivy alone in the dark room, with only a small light. She sat in the corner, hugging her knees, listening to the chaos outside, the gunshots, the explosions, the shouting. She didn't know what was happening or who was attacking or whether Marcus was safe. She only trembled and prayed for the child in her womb and for herself and for the man fighting out there. Time stretched endlessly. Maybe it was an hour or maybe 2. Ivy didn't know. Then the gunfire thinned and stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. Ivy sat, holding her breath and waiting. The steel door opened and she almost cried when she saw Marcus standing there again. He looked far worse with blood on his clothes and hands and face, but he was still standing and alive. He stepped inside, searching for her in the dark. When he saw her curled in the corner, he went to her and knelt before her. He asked in a voice completely different, with no coldness and no command, only real worry, if she was all right. He said you, not her. Ivy looked up at him with tears on her cheeks and nodded, unable to speak. Marcus exhaled as if a great weight had been lifted. He raised his hand to wipe the tears from her face. His hand still stained with blood, but his touch strangely gentle. He asked about the baby with the same worry. Ivy placed her hand on her belly and felt only calm, and whispered that the baby was fine and that they were both fine. Marcus closed his eyes for a second and his lips moved as if in thanks or prayer. Then he opened his eyes and looked at her with a gaze she had never seen before, with no coldness and no distance, only care and worry and something deeper neither of them dared to name. He told her he wouldn't let anyone touch her again. No one. and Ivy believed him. After the attack, the mansion's security was doubled. Dante had people repair the damage, replacing shattered glass and patching bullet holes in the walls. Ivy learned the attackers were men sent by Viktor Kozlov, a Russian mafia boss fighting for territory with the Castellano family. Marcus had eliminated most of them, but the war wasn't over because Kozlov was still out there, and he wouldn't stop. In the days that followed, Marcus didn't allow Ivy to leave the mansion even for a single step. She felt suffocated, but she understood why, because she had seen the danger of the world he lived in, and she knew he was trying to protect her in the only way he knew how. A week after the attack, Ivy still couldn't sleep well. Every night, she woke from nightmares with gunshots echoing in her head and images of blood and chaos. That night was no different. She jolted awake at 2 a.m, soaked in sweat with her heart pounding. She knew she wouldn't fall back asleep, so she went downstairs for a glass of water. The mansion was silent. She walked barefoot through the hall, with moonlight streaking across the marble floor. When she passed the living room, she saw a figure sitting on the sofa in the dark. Her heart raced until she recognized Marcus sitting there with a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out the window. He wasn't sleeping either. Ivy meant to turn away, not wanting to disturb him, but Marcus spoke and told her to come in. She hesitated a second, then entered and sat on the chair opposite him, keeping a careful distance. In the dim moonlight, she saw his face, tired and thoughtful, with the wound on his forehead healed to a faint red mark. Marcus asked if she couldn't sleep either while still looking out the window. Ivy admitted it was nightmares, and that she still heard the gunshots. Marcus nodded as if he understood exactly, and lifted his whiskey to take a sip. Then he suddenly said that the first time he killed someone he was 18, and that it was the night his father was murdered, and he saw the killer and used his father's gun to kill him. Ivy held her breath, not daring to interrupt. Marcus had never told her about that night, and she knew it wasn't something he shared easily. Marcus continued that from that night on, he wasn't a child anymore, and he had to become a leader, and be hard and kill more to protect the family. His mother couldn't bear it, and died 6 months later. People said she was ill, but he knew she died of grief. Ivy felt her heart tighten. She looked at the man before her, and for the first time saw not a powerful boss, but a son who had lost his parents, and a boy whose childhood had been stolen. Ivy said softly that she had lost her parents too, or rather had never had them, and grew up in an orphanage not knowing their faces. Every night she dreamed of a family and a home and someone calling her name with love. When she woke, there were only cold walls and the crying of other lonely children. Marcus turned to look at her, and there was a sympathy in his eyes she had never seen before. Ivy continued bitterly that then she met Tony and thought she finally had a family, but he only gave her more wounds, and 3 years of fear, and 3 years of being beaten, and 3 years of wondering what she had done wrong to deserve it. Ivy didn't realize she was crying until a tear fell on her hand. She hurried to wipe it away, ashamed of her weakness. Before she could, Marcus's hand was on hers, warm and steady and gentle. Ivy looked up at him, surprised. Marcus said nothing. He only held her hand, his fingers tightening slightly like a wordless comfort. They sat like that in silence, 2 broken souls finding each other in the middle of the night. There were no promises and no declarations of love. There was only the warmth of a hand, and the sense that maybe they weren't as alone as they thought. After that night, everything between Marcus and Ivy seemed to shift. Nothing was spoken. No promises were made. Yet an invisible thread had formed between them. Marcus was still cold, still buried in his work and his wars in the underworld, but sometimes Ivy caught him looking at her differently. And Ivy no longer feared him the way she once had. She began to wait for the chance encounters in the hallway, the brief moments when their eyes met. She was 4 months along now, and the baby had begun to kick. Every time she felt that small life moving inside her, she thought of Marcus, of the future, of what might happen after the child was born. One afternoon, while Ivy was drawing in her room, she heard unusual noise from the front of the mansion. Engines, shouting, Dante giving orders. She set her pencil down, stepped into the hallway, and saw a group of men dragging someone inside. The man's hands were tied, his face swollen, blood running from his nose and lips, and yet Ivy recognized him instantly. Tony Ricci, her former husband. Her heart seemed to stop. She stood frozen as Tony was dragged past, and he saw her too, his eyes flashing first with shock, then contempt, then hatred, and he screamed her name before being pulled away, calling her a traitor and shouting that she was sleeping with this mafia boss to get revenge, and that she would regret it. Ivy trembled and backed into the wall. She didn't understand what was happening, or why Tony was here, or why he'd been captured. Rosa appeared beside her, took her hand, and led her back to her room, saying gently, but with worry, that she shouldn't see such things. But Ivy couldn't stay still. After Rosa left, she slipped out and went toward the basement, where she knew Marcus kept his enemies. Her heart pounded as she followed the corridor until she heard voices behind a half-open door. Marcus's voice cold and threatening, Tony's voice shaking and pleading. Ivy stopped and looked inside and nearly screamed at what she saw. Tony was tied to a chair, his face covered in blood, one eye swollen shut. Marcus stood before him with a gun in his hand and a pool of blood at his feet, asking coldly why Tony had contacted Kozlov and sold information about the mansion. Tony coughed blood and sneered that it was for money to pay his debts and that Kozlov promised to erase them if he helped, and that he never expected his useless wife to be here carrying Marcus's child. Marcus raised the gun and aimed at Tony's head and asked without emotion if he was finished. Tony shouted in fury that Ivy was his wife and he had the right to do whatever he wanted to her and that she was worthless and only a whore. Marcus pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, but the bullet tore through Tony's shoulder instead of his head, and Tony screamed in pain as blood poured from the wound. Marcus stepped forward, grabbed Tony by the collar, and roared that Ivy wasn't his wife anymore, that she wasn't a whore, that she was the mother of his child, and that if Tony ever used those words about her again, he'd cut out his tongue before killing him. Ivy stumbled back, unable to watch more, and ran to her room, her heart racing wildly as she tried to erase the image of Marcus shooting Tony from her mind but couldn't. Hours later, she heard footsteps and the door opened and Marcus entered, and Ivy knew he knew she had seen everything. He'd changed his clothes and there was no blood on him, but his eyes were dark and stormy. He said she had seen it, not as a question but as a statement. Ivy sat up and asked why he had almost killed Tony. Marcus said coldly it was because Tony was a traitor who sold information to Kozlov and led the attack. Ivy shook her head and said it wasn't that, and that she'd seen him lose control when Tony spoke about her, and that he wasn't angry about betrayal but about what Tony said about her, and she asked why. Marcus was silent, his jaw clenched. Ivy stepped closer and said he cared about her, and told him to admit it. Marcus looked at her with his gray eyes full of turmoil, then turned toward the door, and before leaving he stopped without turning back, and Ivy whispered for him not to go. He stood still a long moment, and then said hoarsely that he didn't know what caring was, that he only knew that when Tony said those things about her, he wanted to kill him, not because he betrayed him, but because he had once hurt her, and then he left Ivy alone with her heart breaking open. As Marcus stepped into the dimly lit hallway, Dante was waiting for him, his expression neutral but his eyes questioning. "What about Ricci?" Dante asked in a low voice. Marcus gripped the door handle, his knuckles white. "He has caused enough pain," Marcus said coldly. "Dispose of him. I never want his shadow to fall on this house, or Ivy again." Dante nodded, understanding the finality in the boss's order, and disappeared into the darkness. That night after Marcus left, Ivy lay on her bed staring up at the ceiling in the dark. His last words echoed again and again in her mind, that he had wanted to kill Tony because Tony had once hurt her. She realized that in 27 years of life, through all the pain and humiliation, she hadn't had anyone say something like that to her. She hadn't had anyone be angry because she'd been hurt. She hadn't had anyone want to protect her the way Marcus had. Then the tears came, not tears of pain but of something she couldn't name. Maybe it was being moved. Maybe it was gratitude. Maybe it was love beginning to grow in her heart that she was afraid to admit. She cried for having met Tony, for remembering the hell she had lived through with him. She cried for seeing Marcus shoot him, for witnessing the cruelty of the man whose child she was carrying. She cried because she no longer knew where she was or who she was or what she was feeling. She curled into herself, hugged her pillow, and let the tears fall. Her sobs filled the silent room and she didn't try to stop them. Outside the door, Marcus stood in the dark. He'd been there for some time listening to her cry, the sound passing through the wooden door and into his chest, and touching something deep inside that he thought had died long ago. He wanted to go in and hold her and say something to make her stop crying, but he didn't know how. Marcus Castellano could face hundreds of enemies without fear and order someone's death without blinking, but he didn't know how to comfort a woman who was crying. He stood there a long while with his hand on the door as if he might push it open, but he didn't dare. Then he turned and went quickly down the stairs. Rosa was in the kitchen and looked surprised to see him and asked what he needed. Marcus said hoarsely that he needed flowers and asked if there were any in the house. Rosa studied him for a moment, then nodded. She went to the garden and returned with a bunch of freshly cut red roses still beaded with night dew. Marcus took them without a word and left. He returned to Ivy's room where the crying had stopped. Maybe she was asleep, or maybe she was lying in silence. He placed the roses gently outside her door without making a sound, leaving no note, not knocking, saying nothing at all. Then he went back to his room with a heart heavy with feelings he didn't know how to name. The next morning, when Ivy opened her door, she almost stepped on the red roses at the threshold and bent to pick them up, their petals soft and still fresh. There was no card and no message, but she knew who they were from. She held the flowers to her chest, and for the first time in many days she smiled. In the days that followed, Ivy placed the red roses in a vase on the table by the window. Every morning she woke and smiled at the petals, thinking of the man who had left them at her door in the middle of the night. Marcus never mentioned the flowers, and Ivy never asked, but something subtle shifted between them, as if an invisible wall had thinned a little. Ivy was 5 months along, and it was time for her scheduled ultrasound. This time Marcus said he would go with her. Ivy was surprised to hear that from Rosa and didn't know how to feel. Anxious, nervous, and a little like hope, they went to the family's private clinic in the morning. Marcus sat on the chair beside the examination bed, with his face as cold as ever. But Ivy noticed he was watching her more closely than usual. The doctor spread cold gel on her belly and moved the ultrasound probe. Blurry black and white images appeared on the screen, and Ivy held her breath. The doctor moved the probe for a while, then stopped and frowned and looked more closely, then shifted the probe again. Ivy began to worry and asked if something was wrong. The doctor didn't answer at once, but continued checking. Finally, he looked up at Marcus, and then at Ivy, with a strange expression, and said he had surprising news. It wasn't 1 baby. It was 2. Ivy thought she'd misheard and repeated, too unsure. The doctor confirmed twins and turned the screen toward them, pointing out 2 small moving shapes. He said this was baby 1 and this was baby 2, and both were healthy and developing normally. Ivy stared at the screen at the 2 small lives inside her, and tears began to fall. She covered her mouth, unable to speak. 2 babies. She was carrying 2 babies. Marcus sat still like a statue and stared at the screen. Ivy saw something change on his face. The ice seemed to melt and reveal an expression she'd never seen before. Surprise, emotion, and maybe happiness. The doctor turned on the sound and played the heartbeat of baby 1. A fast, steady rhythm filled the room. Then the heartbeat of baby 2 joined it, creating a miraculous music of life. Ivy cried without holding back because she was hearing the hearts of her 2 children, the 2 small lives she had carried for 5 months. She had thought this was only a transaction and a contract. But now hearing those heartbeats, she knew everything was different. These were her children, no matter what the contract said and no matter that she would have to give them up. Right now, they were hers. Then she felt a hand take hers, warm and steady. She turned and saw Marcus looking at her with gray eyes shining in an unfamiliar way. He held her hand, not in a hurried way like before, but with intention and meaning. He said nothing, but his hand said everything. Ivy looked at him through her tears and tightened her grip on his hand. They sat like that, listening to the heartbeats of their unborn children. On the way back to the mansion, they sat beside each other in the back seat. Marcus still held Ivy's hand, his fingers laced with hers naturally. He said nothing the whole way. He only stared out the window with a distant look, but he didn't let go. Ivy looked down at their joined hands, his large, rough hand and her small, delicate one. 2 people from different worlds holding hands, and she didn't want to let go. After the ultrasound that day, Marcus changed in ways Ivy hadn't expected. He began coming home earlier. He spent less time in his office and more time with her. For the first time, they ate dinner together, at the large dining table in the main room, instead of Ivy eating alone with Rosa as before. Marcus sat across from her, and even though he was still quiet, his presence made the room feel warmer. Their conversations began with small things. He asked how she was feeling, whether the babies were kicking much, whether she needed anything. Ivy answered, and slowly began to ask in return whether his work was hard, whether he was tired, whether his old injuries still hurt. Marcus wasn't used to being cared about or having someone ask him those things. He didn't know how to answer at first, but he tried for her. One evening they were sitting in the living room after dinner. Ivy was drawing. Marcus was on the sofa reading reports. He couldn't focus and kept glancing at her. Finally, he set the papers down and told her she drew beautifully. Ivy looked up, surprised by the sudden praise, and thanked him with a small smile. She said she once dreamed of becoming an artist and opening a small gallery to show her work, but life hadn't allowed it. Marcus asked why not, leaning forward. Ivy smiled sadly and said she had to survive before she could dream, and that the orphanage hadn't taught them to follow passion but how not to starve. Then when she met Tony, she thought she could finally live for herself. But he took everything, including the drawings she had made, and burned them all in a drunken rage. Marcus was silent for a long time. Then he said something Ivy hadn't expected. He said he once wanted to be an architect. Ivy looked at him, unable to hide her surprise, because the most powerful mafia boss in New York dreaming of being an architect sounded like a joke, but Marcus's eyes were completely serious. He said that when he was a child, he loved building things and used wooden blocks to build small buildings, imagining that one day he'd design real ones. He said his father supported him and told him his son could be anything he wanted. Then his father was killed and Marcus had to take over the family, and there was no room for dreams. Ivy looked at him and saw a different Marcus. Not the cold boss, and not the ruthless killer, but a young man who once had dreams and wanted a normal life. She said gently that it was never too late and that he could still design something, maybe a home for the children. Marcus looked at her and something shifted in his eyes when she said the children, as if they were hers too. Ivy realized what she'd said and blushed and stumbled trying to explain. Marcus stood and came closer. Ivy stopped speaking as her heart beat faster when he sat beside her on the couch, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne mixed with sandalwood. He called her name in a low, warm voice. She looked up and saw his gray eyes holding an intensity she didn't dare name. Marcus said he didn't know if this was right. He said he didn't know how to love or how to open his heart. But when he was with her, he wanted to try. Before Ivy could answer, Marcus leaned down and kissed her. It was a gentle, hesitant kiss, as if he were afraid she'd push him away. But she didn't. She closed her eyes and returned the kiss. Her heart raced and her body trembled, not with fear but with a feeling she thought she'd lost forever. When they parted, Marcus rested his forehead against hers and whispered that he wouldn't hurt her and that he swore it. Ivy smiled through her tears and said she believed him. For the first time, she truly did. The days after the first kiss were the happiest Ivy had ever known. She and Marcus no longer kept their distance the way they had before. They ate breakfast together, walked in the garden together, and every night Marcus stopped by her room to wish her good night before she went to sleep. She was 6 months along now. The twins were kicking more and more strongly, and every time they moved, Ivy called Marcus to come feel it. He placed his hand on her belly and his cold expression softened and his eyes lit with a happiness he no longer tried to hide. Ivy began to think about the future. A future where she might not have to leave. A future where she and Marcus and the 2 babies could be together like a real family. She knew it was naive. Knew the contract was still there. But she allowed herself to hope. That afternoon, the weather was beautiful, and Ivy wanted to go into the garden for some fresh air. Marcus was in an important meeting with Dante and the other leaders, so she went alone. The back garden was wide and quiet, flowers blooming under the afternoon sun, and Ivy walked along the stone path with one hand supporting her belly and the other brushing the roses on the fence. She didn't realize she was being watched. When she reached a secluded corner where the trees blocked the view from the mansion, everything happened too fast. A hand clamped over her mouth from behind, another arm wrapped around her, and Ivy struggled and tried to scream, but the sharp smell of chemicals filled her nose and her head spun and then everything went black. When Ivy woke, she was lying on cold concrete in a dark room with her hands tied behind her back and tape over her mouth, and her heart raced as she realized she'd been kidnapped, and she tried to sit up and pain shot through her belly, and she thought of the babies, and fear flooded her. And the door opened, and a man stepped in. Tall, blonde, with icy blue eyes, and a long scar running from his temple down his cheek. Viktor Kozlov, the Russian Mafia boss Marcus had mentioned, and now she was in his hands. And Kozlov smiled cruelly and said that this was Marcus Castellano's precious prey, and that she was carrying his children, and that it was interesting, and he knelt in front of her and ripped the tape from her mouth, and Ivy gasped in pain, but she didn't cry or beg, and instead stared at him with all the hatred she had and asked what he wanted, and Kozlov answered calmly that he wanted Marcus's empire, and that she would help him get it. At the Castellano mansion, Marcus was ending the meeting when a guard ran in breathless, and said Ivy was gone, and Marcus leapt to his feet and roared, "What do you mean gone?" And the guard said they'd searched everywhere, and found signs of a struggle in the back garden, and Marcus ran outside and saw unfamiliar footprints, broken branches, and a piece of fabric from Ivy's dress caught on the fence. And Dante followed and said it had to be Kozlov, and Marcus said nothing, and stared at the scrap of cloth in his hand, and for the first time in his life, felt real fear. Not for himself, but for Ivy and for his unborn children, and his phone rang with an unknown number, and Kozlov's voice said Ivy was with him, and she and the babies were safe for now, and if Marcus wanted them to live, he knew what to do, to hand over the Eastern Territory, and withdraw from the port and the shipping routes, and that he had 24 hours, and Marcus crushed the phone in his hand and shouted that if Kozlov touched her even a hair, he'd tear him apart. And Kozlov laughed and said Marcus wasn't in a position to threaten and repeated 24 hours and hung up, and Marcus stood there shaking with rage and fear, and Dante asked what about the territory, and Marcus turned with a look Dante had never seen, and said Kozlov could take everything, the territory, the money, the power, all of it, but he couldn't touch Ivy because she mattered more than anything. And Dante stared, realizing that for the first time, Marcus Castellano had placed something above the family and the empire his father built, and that it was for a woman. And Dante nodded and said he understood, and that they would find her. 12 hours after Ivy was kidnapped, Marcus's men found where Kozlov was hiding her. It was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Brooklyn, guarded by more than 30 Russian gunmen. Marcus didn't wait a second longer. He mobilized nearly 50 men with heavy weapons and moved out that same night. On the way, Marcus sat silent in the car, gripping his gun, his gray eyes dark as a storm. He hadn't slept since Ivy vanished. He hadn't eaten or rested. He had only one thought in his head. Find her, bring her back, kill anyone who dared touch her. When the convoy stopped a few hundred meters from the warehouse, Marcus was the first to step out. Dante grabbed his arm and told him their men should go in first and that he shouldn't risk himself. Marcus pulled away and said she was in there, and he'd be the first in. The raid began. Gunfire tore through the night. Marcus's men attacked from all sides, breaking the outer defense in minutes. Marcus led them, moving like a deadly shadow, shooting down anyone in his way without hesitation. Blood sprayed the walls. Bodies fell. He didn't stop. He pushed deeper, stepping over corpses in pools of blood with only one goal: Ivy. He found Kozlov upstairs in a room with an iron door. The Russian boss stood there with a gun in his hand and Ivy tied to a chair behind him, blindfolded and gagged. When Marcus saw her, his heart clenched. She was alive but trembling and bruised. Kozlov mocked him and said he'd arrived sooner than expected and that one bullet would kill her and the babies instantly. Marcus stopped but didn't lower his gun. He asked what Kozlov wanted. Kozlov said territory and power and everything Marcus's father built. He told Marcus to lower the gun and he'd spare her. Marcus looked at Ivy's shaking body, then at Kozlov, and made a decision. He lowered his gun. Kozlov smiled in triumph. Before he could finish speaking, Marcus drew a small gun from his sleeve and fired one shot. The bullet went through Kozlov's forehead, and the Russian boss collapsed in shock. Marcus rushed to Ivy and tore off her blindfold. When she saw him, she sobbed his name. He whispered that he was here, and that she was safe, and cut her free. She fell into his arms crying, and he held her like she might vanish again. He kissed her hair and forehead and cheeks with blood still on his hands. He asked if she and the babies were all right. Ivy said they were. Marcus held her tighter and swore he was sorry he hadn't protected her and that no one would touch her again and that she was his life and she and the babies were all he had. Ivy cried in his arms, not in fear but in relief and happiness and love. Marcus carried her out of the bloody room in the warehouse. Outside, Dante and the men had secured everything and sighed in relief when they saw Marcus carrying Ivy. On the way back, Ivy sat in Marcus's arms with her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. She didn't ask about Kozlov or the fight or what he'd done. She only held him, knowing she'd been saved not just that night, but from the lonely, painful life she'd lived for so long. Marcus kissed her forehead and whispered that he loved her. It was the first time he'd said those words. After the kidnapping, Marcus didn't leave Ivy's side for a moment. He officially moved into her room. He slept beside her every night and hired an additional doctor to stay in the mansion around the clock. Ivy recovered quickly, both physically and emotionally, thanks to Marcus's constant care and Rosa's gentle attention. Her belly grew larger. The twins kicked more strongly, as if they too could feel the love surrounding their mother. The final months of pregnancy passed in peace. Marcus and Ivy spent their days together preparing the nursery, choosing each tiny outfit and each small toy. They never spoke about the contract or the future. They only lived in the present and cherished every shared moment. Ivy painted pictures of the family she dreamed of Marcus, of the two children, and hung them in the nursery like silent blessings. But fate didn't leave them untouched. When she was 8 months along, Ivy woke one night with a sudden sharp pain in her lower belly. She cried out and Marcus sprang up instantly. When he turned on the light, he saw blood on the sheets and his face went pale because it was too early. The doctor was called at once. He examined Ivy and declared she was in premature labor and needed to go to the hospital immediately. Marcus carried her to the car with trembling hands and a heart pounding like it might burst. He held her hand the entire way and repeated words of reassurance he himself didn't fully believe, telling her she'd be fine and the babies would be fine. Fear filled his eyes in a way Ivy had never seen before. At the hospital, everything became chaos. The doctors announced an emergency surgery was needed because one of the babies was in distress. Ivy was taken into the operating room and Marcus was stopped outside. He stood there staring at the closed doors, feeling completely powerless for the first time in his life. He'd fought countless enemies and built an empire and ordered death without blinking. But he couldn't do anything to protect the woman he loved and their children. Dante stood beside him in silence. Rosa arrived and held his shoulder. Marcus felt none of it. He only watched the door and waited. For the first time in decades, he prayed. He prayed for Ivy, for the twins, for the family he was about to have. He promised God, the universe, anyone who might be listening that he'd do anything to protect them, that he'd change, that he'd become better if only they were safe. Time stretched endlessly. 1 hour, then another. Finally, the door opened, and the doctor stepped out, smiling, and said the mother and babies were safe, and both were healthy. A boy and a girl. Marcus froze as if he couldn't believe what he'd heard. Then he rushed inside without caring about any rules or protests. He saw Ivy lying on the bed, exhausted but smiling, and beside her the 2 tiny newborns wrapped in white blankets. Marcus stepped closer and looked down at his children. So small and red and perfect, with tiny fingers and closed eyes. The boy with dark hair like his, and the girl with Ivy's delicate features, so beautiful he could hardly breathe. Ivy whispered weakly that they were his children, then corrected herself and said they were their children. Marcus knelt beside the bed with one hand holding Ivy's and the other gently touching his son's cheek. Then something Ivy never thought she'd see happened. Tears streamed down Marcus's face. He cried openly without restraint or shame, the tears of a man whose heart had been frozen for years now, melting in love. He thanked Ivy in a broken voice for giving him them, for giving him something he never believed he deserved, a family. Ivy cried with him, and they stayed there together beside their 2 children, crying from happiness. Crying because at last they had what both of them had longed for their entire lives. 2 weeks after giving birth, Ivy had fully recovered. She spent most of her time with the babies, feeding them, changing their diapers, and singing them to sleep. Marcus was beside her whenever he could, awkwardly learning how to hold them and how to soothe them when they cried. Rosa watched them and smiled, saying it was the happiest family she'd ever seen, but inside Ivy a shadow was growing. The contract. She remembered every clause she'd signed. She remembered the cold lines that said after birth she would give up all maternal rights, take the money, and leave. The contract said nothing about love and nothing about what she and Marcus had become to each other. Even though Marcus had said he loved her, and even though he'd cried when he saw the babies, he hadn't mentioned tearing up the contract. Ivy began to worry that maybe for Marcus love was one thing, and contracts were another, that he was a businessman and a mafia boss who lived by deals and transactions, that maybe he expected her to keep her word and leave as promised, that maybe he was just waiting for her to recover so he could remind her. These thoughts ate at her day by day. Every night when Marcus held her as she slept, she wondered if it was their last night. Every time she held the babies, she wondered how much longer she'd be allowed to. She wanted to ask Marcus what he thought, but she was afraid. Afraid the answer would be something she didn't want to hear. Then one day while she was feeding the babies, she heard Marcus talking on the phone with the family lawyer in the next room. Through the half-open door, she heard him say the contract and that it should be prepared and that he'd handle it this week. Ivy felt her heart tighten. She knew he was talking about her contract and preparing to end everything. She couldn't hear anything else. Her mind was spinning and tears were falling uncontrollably. She thought it was over. No matter what he said about loving her and no matter what they'd been through, she was still just a contract to be resolved. That night, when Marcus came home late from a meeting, Ivy made a decision. She wouldn't wait to be sent away like something expired. She'd leave on her own with what dignity she had left. She wouldn't take the money or anything from him. She'd only keep the memories no matter how painful they were. She quietly opened the wardrobe and took out a small suitcase. She didn't take the expensive dresses Marcus bought for her. She only took a few simple clothes and the drawings she'd made while she was there. Tears ran down her face as she folded each item, but she made no sound. She went into the nursery and looked at the babies sleeping peacefully. She bent down and kissed each of their foreheads, whispering a goodbye she didn't have the courage to say out loud. She told them she loved them, and would always love them, and asked them to forgive her for not being able to stay. She stood up and turned and almost screamed when she saw Marcus standing in the doorway. He looked at her and at the suitcase in her hand. His face shifted from surprise to pain. He asked hoarsely where she thought she was going. Ivy couldn't answer. She only stood there with tears falling, not knowing what to say. Marcus stepped into the room, his eyes never leaving the suitcase in Ivy's hand. He asked again where she thought she was going, his voice tight with tension and pain. Ivy swallowed her tears and tried to keep her voice steady, even as her heart was breaking into pieces. She said she was leaving as the contract required. She said he'd spoken to the lawyer and was preparing to settle it. She said she understood and would leave before he had to send her away. Marcus froze, his face shifting from pain to confusion. He asked if she'd heard that conversation. Ivy nodded, tears still falling. She said she didn't want the money or anything at all and only wanted to leave with what little dignity she had left. She begged him to let her go. Marcus looked at her for a long moment and then did something she never expected. He laughed. It wasn't a mocking laugh. It was a laugh of relief and misery and of a man realizing he'd almost lost what mattered most. He asked if she really thought he wanted her to go. He asked if she really thought, after everything they'd been through, he'd let her leave. Ivy stared at him, not understanding. She said he'd spoken to the lawyer about the contract. Marcus nodded. He said yes because he'd told the lawyer to prepare a new contract. A marriage contract. Ivy thought she'd misheard. She stood there with her mouth open, unable to make a sound. Marcus stepped closer and gently took the suitcase from her hand and set it on the floor. He pulled a stack of papers from his pocket. Ivy recognized the contract she'd signed months before. He held it up and said this was what had brought her to him, and also what had kept them apart. He said he'd been wrong to think he could use money and contracts to have a child without love. He said he'd been wrong to think love was a weakness. He said she'd proven him completely wrong. Then in front of her, he tore the contract in half, then into quarters, then into smaller pieces. The paper fell like snow to the floor, and Ivy watched it fall with tears pouring uncontrollably. Marcus said he didn't want a contract anymore. He said he wanted her. He said he wanted to wake up beside her every morning and watch her feed the children, and hear her sing them to sleep every night and grow old with her, and watch the children grow and build a real family, not because of a contract, but because he loved her. Then Marcus did something Ivy never thought she'd see. He went down on one knee in front of her. The most powerful Mafia boss in New York knelt before the homeless girl he'd met in a dark alley months before. He looked up at her with complete sincerity and said he knew he didn't deserve her, and had done terrible things and killed people, and lived in darkness his whole life. But she'd brought light into his life and given him 2 wonderful completer and Hall children, and more than that, she'd taught him what love was. He said he didn't know how to propose properly, and didn't have a diamond ring or roses or romantic words, and only had his heart, which he was placing at her feet. He asked her to stay with him and be his wife. Ivy stood there looking at the man kneeling before her who'd once been cold and ruthless, and had bought her like an object, and was now begging her to stay. She thought of everything they'd been through. The nights he cared for her when she was sick, the times he protected her from danger, their first kiss, his tears when the children were born, and how he'd changed for her and for the children. She asked how she could know he wouldn't change his mind or send her away when things became difficult. Marcus stood and took her hands and looked straight into her eyes. He said he'd lived without her before, and knew he didn't want to live that way again. He said she'd changed him. He said before her he'd been an empty shell, living in darkness, thinking that was all he deserved. He said she'd shown him another way to live. He said he didn't know how to prove it, but was willing to spend his whole life trying, every day showing her he deserved her love. Ivy's tears fell, but no longer from pain, but from happiness and relief and love. She looked at Marcus, who'd gone from a cold stranger to the man she loved most in the world, and nodded and said she'd stay and would be his wife. Marcus pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if afraid she'd vanish. They stood there among the scattered pieces of the torn contract, holding each other and crying. Behind them in the crib, the 2 babies slept peacefully, unaware that their lives had just changed forever, and that they'd grow up with both a mother and a father, and with love and protection, and would never know the loneliness and abandonment their parents once had. That was all Marcus and Ivy had ever wanted. 1 month later, a small wedding was held in the garden of the Castellano estate, with no hundreds of guests and no extravagant display, only the people closest to them. Dante stood as the witness. Rosa cried through the entire ceremony out of happiness. The 2 babies were placed in a lovely little crib beside the flower altar. Ivy wore a simple white dress with her dark hair falling over her shoulders, and she had never looked more beautiful in Marcus's eyes. He stood there in a black suit, watching her walk toward him, with a tenderness no one would ever expect from a Mafia boss. When they exchanged rings, Marcus swore he'd protect Ivy and the children with his life, and Ivy swore she'd love him no matter how dark his past had been. They kissed beneath the sunset, as if in that moment all the suffering of the past had finally melted away. 1 year later, life in the Castellano estate had completely changed. The laughter of the 2 children filled every corner and chased away the heavy darkness that once hung over the house. Marcus had reduced his underground operations and spent more time with his family. He was still powerful, but now he had a reason to live and someone to come home to. Ivy opened a small art gallery in the city displaying the paintings she'd created during her pregnancy and after giving birth, so her dream finally became real. One afternoon, Marcus and Ivy sat in the garden watching the children take their first unsteady steps on the green grass. Their son, named Alessandro, after his grandfather tried to chase a butterfly. Their daughter, named Sophia, after her grandmother held Rosa's hand as she practiced walking. Ivy leaned her head on Marcus's shoulder and asked if he was happy. He said he once thought happiness was power and money and the fear of his enemies, but she'd shown him what real happiness was, and that it was her and the children and this family, and that he'd never been happier. Ivy smiled and thanked him for giving her a home and a family. Marcus kissed her forehead and thanked her for giving him a heart. They sat there hand in hand watching their children play in the afternoon sunlight. They knew their life wasn't perfect and that danger and enemies still existed in Marcus's world, but that they had each other and that was all they needed. Suddenly, Alessandro and Sophia called out together in their clumsy little voices, saying Mama and Dada. Marcus and Ivy looked at each other and laughed as happy tears fell down their cheeks. They stood and went to their children and held them close with all the love they had. The The story of Marcus and Ivy shows us that love can come from the most unexpected places, and that people can change when they find a reason to change, and that family isn't always what we're born into, but sometimes what we choose to build. No matter how painful the past has been, or how many times life has beaten you down, there's always hope for a brighter tomorrow. We'd love to know how this story made you feel, and whether you believe love can truly change a person, so please share your thoughts in the comments below, because we truly want to hear what's in your heart. If this story touched you, please like it, share it with the people you love, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the stories we share each day. We wish all of you watching good health and a peaceful, joyful life. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next story.